Hey everyone, this is a review of Wahuda's new 13-inch 2-speed thickness planer with a carbide spiral cutter head. So after I bought my own Wahuda 8-inch joiner and posted a review of it, Wahuda contacted me and asked me to take a look at their planer, do a review of it, and a setup guide just like I did for the joiner. So we're going to do a walk-around tour of all the features this has, how to set it up right and get it dialed in perfectly, and then most importantly, how it performs. The planer comes packed really well. It came in a box inside a box, and then inside of that is a big styrofoam clamshell. It's really well protected. So first of all, the external features of this planer are pretty standard design as far as the structure goes and everything like that. Your typical benchtop planer looks really similar to this one. Things that set it apart is it's got 2 speeds, it's got a spiral carbide cutter head. Note that's not a helical cutter head, so the cutters are perpendicular to the workpiece. There are pros and cons to each one of these. Either way, a carbide insert cutter head is vastly superior to a straight knife cutter head, in my opinion. Another feature that really sets this planer apart is the infeed and outfeed tables. They're a good, generous length. You've got 34 inches from the front infeed table to the back of the outfeed table, and if that's not enough, you've also got these additional support rollers that pop out another 5.5 inches, giving you a total of 45 inches from front to end that support you have for the beam, for the boards that you're running through this. The carriage rides up and down on 4 different posts, all with a pitch of 16 threads per inch. So one revolution of the top handle will give you 1/16 of an inch up or down with the cutter head. The cutter head goes all the way down to 1/8 of an inch, all the way up to 6 inches. So it's got a good range for thicknesses of materials that you can plane. On the underside of the planer is a chain that rotates all of the columns together and keeps your planer head parallel all the way across. The speed selection lever is over here. You only want to shift it while it's running, but up is the 26 feet per minute faster speed, and down is the 18 feet per minute fine speed. All right, so underneath here you can see the 2 rollers, the front and the back one, along with the cutter head. These do a good job of feeding the stock through. Of course, waxing the bed helps a lot too. And the cutter head does a great job of keeping the noise down. It's not quite as loud as some of the other designs I've used with straight knives, just because you're not hitting the whole workpiece with one long straight blade at a time. It's staggered a little bit more, so it's not quite as noisy. The depth indicator right here is easily adjustable, and it's got inches and millimeters, which is actually really nice. There are a couple other nice touches on this that I haven't seen with other planers. Instead of relying on friction for the tables to stay up when you stow them, there are 2 magnet posts here on the front, and on the back, if you remove the dust shroud, there are 2 more magnet posts you can install, and it clicks up there really securely and holds on. I really like that feature. When you're moving this thing around through the shop, you're not going to have the table flop down and smack something. Front and center is your depth gauge. It's going to tell you how much you're taking off the current workpiece. So it's just got a little button under here attached to a spring-loaded indicator, and you just slide the very tip of the board in, and it tells you how deep of a pass you're going to make. On the right side of this, you've got a depth stop for repeated cutting. I found it to be very accurate. I tested the 1/4 inch and the 1/2 inch settings, and they were dead on for mine, like to the thousandths of an inch, dead on. So it starts down at 1/8 of an inch, goes to 1/4 of an inch, and then it goes up every 1/4 of an inch all the way to 1 3/4 on this side. If you look inside here, you've just got a bunch of turrets that rotate around, and that bolt right there, which is adjustable, comes down and hits them on the stop. There are also 4 mounting holes, 1 on each corner, for fastening this down to a worktop, which you should do before you start planing big long boards. On the back, you've got your dust shroud cover and your cutter head cover, and they're all held in by thumb screws, which are pretty easy to remove. And I've got a Rockler Dust-Rite right angle elbow on this. I'd highly recommend putting something like this on this, because this does get pretty low to the work surface. So if you've got your hose without any support coming off of there, it'll just be kind of hanging out and catching anything coming out on the outfeed table. When you remove the cutter head cover, always make sure your machine is unplugged. This is actually pretty easy for servicing. Instead of having to take the whole thing apart, you just take this back cover off, and there's your cutter head. As far as chip collection goes, and chip extraction, the mower's got a blower that comes out right here, and it goes into this, and then out the dust shroud that comes right here. It's got okay airflow coming out through there. You'll definitely still need a dust collector, but it was able to inflate, a little bit lazily, but it was able to inflate the top bag on my dust collector without me having the dust collector on. Dust collection on this is pretty good. It's not perfect though. I was getting some chips as I was planing, especially when I was doing wider boards. It's not as good as some of the other planers I've used, but it's pretty good. Included with the planer is a 4-inch to 2.5-inch dust collector adapter, a T-handle Torx T25 key, a 2mm Allen key, and I think it's a 4mm Allen key as well. You'll also need a handful of other tools that aren't included. I'll put a list of these in the video description. Consumables you'll need: paste wax for the bed, 3-in-1 oil to put on the screws for the cutters when you're installing them, a duster, and mineral spirits also to clean the oil off of the cutters and the cutter head initially. As far as setting up the in-feed and out-feed tables, it's pretty simple. You want them perfectly coplanar with the planer bed right here. So you're going to reference off this bed. Don't reference off the far table because you're going to do one table at a time, and you've got several adjustment points. There are 6 screws, 3 on each side of this platform, that allow this sheet metal to kind of float. So loosen all of these up first. Your other adjustment point is a bolt at the bottom with a lock nut. This is your course adjustment. It controls the whole angle that the planer in-feed and out-feed tables sit at. So we're going to adjust this one first. That's opposite from the instructions in the manual. Do my way because I one-shotted my table adjustments without having to go back and forth, and their instructions in the manual tell you to go back and forth a whole bunch of times until it's perfect. So we're going to loosen up the lock nuts on both sides. You'll need 2 10mm wrenches because you've got a 10mm lock nut and a 10mm bolt head. And for these, you need a 2.5mm Allen key to loosen them up, and I've already done so. Take a level, reference off of your planer bed. You want it a little bit below level, so you want the table, the in-feed, out-feed table, a little bit below this surface, because what we're going to do is we're going to take up the slack, take up the difference with the steel stamped table instead of the support arm, because when you tighten down this lock nut, you stretch this bolt a little bit, which puts the head a little bit higher, which can push the whole thing up above the table, and you don't want that. So you start with it a little bit lower than the table. You're going to take up the difference with this platform adjustability with the 3 screws on each side. Just want to bring it up to almost no gap. That looks good. You take this out, flip the table up, and tighten the lock nut. Make sure you don't let this bolt head move. All right, and I don't see any gaps up here on the table when I'm keeping that far corner down on the level. So we're good to go with the second side. Do both sides with the bolt first, and then we'll do the fine adjustment later. All right, this is where magnetic level comes in really handy because this plate can still move on those rails. So we're going to take our magnetic level, make sure it's flat on the planer bed. You're going to have to push down probably unless you have a shorter one. And then let those magnets suck the steel plate up against the level. And you got to make sure that you're still in contact with this bolt head with your support arm. It's not pulling the whole thing up. So you got to make sure it pulled the plate up and it didn't pull the support arm up. But once you've done that, you just tighten these screws down because you've got the magnetic level holding your plate up to a perfectly parallel coplanar position. How's that for easy? Then you might want to check it with the non-magnetic side, and there are no gaps there. Good to go. Same thing with this side. You can do this without a magnetic level, but you're going to need a third hand. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and forth a whole bunch and fiddle with it like the instruction manual tells you to do. There's how to one-shot the table setup for this. One other thing, you got to make sure this roller right here that extends out is below the table surface when you're doing that, because the next step is adjusting this. I refer to this as a roller a couple times. It's not really a roller. It's just a support arm with a cylinder contact point, so it's a line contact point, but it doesn't actually rotate. So to set up the support arms, you just loosen these knurled knobs on either side and pull the arms out. And you want to line this up with the table. So put your level on the table surface and put it out here. And if this isn't touching and this isn't flat on the table surface, you need to adjust it. And the adjustment point is this little set screw right here with a lock nut. So it's a 7mm lock nut with a 2mm, sorry, Allen key that goes in that set screw. So first you loosen the lock nut. And then if you watch over here, you see that arm go up and down. And you can see it's actually pushing the level off of the table over here. So we don't want to do that. So you want it just high enough that it's in contact with the level, but not lifting it off of the in-feed, out-feed table. Once you've got it in the right spot, tighten the lock nut back down. Now one gripe I have with this set screw is in a tapped hole that is nowhere near perpendicular with the surface of this little tab. So this set screw, the bearing surface doesn't actually contact the tab except for at one extreme point, which isn't great for holding its position. It's in contact here and it's in contact here. It should stay in place when you move it back in. Sometimes, yeah, it did. Sometimes I've had to mess with it a little bit because for some reason this sits up a little bit higher or a little bit lower when I push it back in. So if you do have that problem, kind of mess with it a little bit more trying to get it right. Otherwise, you're going to have to pick, do you want it level with the table here or farther out at the full extension, and just pick which way you use it the most often to set it at that height. And once you've done this side, just go back and do the other side for each table. So before planing any lumber, you're going to want to clean the cutter head because it comes with oil all over it in the cutters. What you're going to do is you're going to remove these two star knobs on this back cover. Pull that off. Make sure before you do this your machine is unplugged because you're exposing the cutter head at this point. And then you're going to go through each of these cutters and remove them with the included Torx key. And you're going to drop them in mineral oil to get the oil off of them. And then you're going to wipe down this cutter head once you've got all the cutters off of it, also with mineral oil, and then get it nice and dry and reinstall the cutters. And if you don't do this, you will spray oil all over whatever wood you're trying to plane, which you really don't want. One thing that's a little bit annoying, I don't know if you've noticed this when I'm taking these off, these aren't all indexed the same. You want them indexed the same because you want to know which side you've used. So they've got numbers 1 through 4 on them. So when you're reinstalling these afterwards, go ahead and switch it to, I'm going to do 1 on the top left corner, and that way I know how many times I've rotated that. But they don't come pre-installed like that, so that's just something you got to pay attention to when you're putting them back on. Not a huge deal since you got to take these out anyway to clean them. So now that we have these seated properly and snug down, you're going to go back and torque them to 48 to 50 inch-pounds. And that oil you put on those threads is going to help you get a more consistent torque because less of it's going to friction and more of it's going to stretching the fastener and giving you the proper tension on these heads to keep the cutters in place. So that chamfer here and the bevel that hits up against that rail is going to orient these properly. So it's important you get the right torque and the right tension in those fasteners. The 48 to 50 inch-pounds is a bit much for a regular screwdriver style. They are a little bit cheaper. I'm using this one that's got a nice extra bit of leverage. You can also use a regular 1/4-inch drive torque wrench, provided it goes down to the 48 to 50 inch-pounds that you need for these torque specs. So let's talk performance. This is a precision tool, and the goal for this tool is to start with a board with one flat side and make the other side perfectly parallel with a uniform thickness throughout the whole board. So how well does it do with that job? So start off with one thing planers have a lot of problems with that people probably fight with the most with planers is snipe. And that's at the very end of your board. It's just a little bit thinner at the very end if you have snipe problems. In this one, if you just set a board flat on the tables and send it through after you've leveled the tables and gotten them coplanar, I was getting 2/1000 of an inch snipe, that's thickness variation, about the last 2 inches of the board. So that's actually pretty good without taking any countermeasures against snipe. When I picked up on the end of the board as I fed it in and then picked up on the front of the board as I pulled it out, I was able to get 0 snipe with this planer. So great results on this, very little snipe, and even if you do get snipe, it's only 2 inches at the end, which isn't a very long distance. All right, so the design of this cutter head has those individual 26 carbide inserts that are just over a 1/2 inch wide, and there's a little bit overlap on each of those so you don't have any gaps in your boards when you're planing them. I was a little bit concerned the individual cutters would leave striping on the boards that I was planing. For the most part, I'm not seeing that. In the center of the planer, in the very center, I don't see any indication that there's individual cutters. They're all perfectly aligned. At the very edges, I do see faint little stripes, little raised portions on the edge of the workpiece when I'm right at the edge on either side on this platform. If I don't plane at the edge, I don't see it. And those stripes are only about 1/100th of an inch wide and about 2/1000ths of an inch tall. So they sand right out with 320 grit. If you take a hand sanding block and just do one pass over them, they're gone. So I don't think it's a big deal. Just know that the cutter head does seem to have some misalignment at the very edges, and I went back and I reseated the cutters. I swapped out the cutters. I re-indexed the cutters. Tried to do everything to get rid of them, and I couldn't. Now, I did talk to Wahuda about that, and they said they'd seen that on one of their pre-production samples they've run, and it seemed to vary with the wood species and what they ran through it. So you might not even get anything like that in your planer, but just know that you could, and it's a very easy fix, just sand. The surface of the boards is also really smooth. I don't see any scalloping, and scalloping happens because you've got a circular cutter head cutting a flat board, and you just have to have a high enough cuts per inch and a big enough diameter cutter head that it doesn't really manifest in anything that you can actually feel. So this does have a lower cuts per inch than most other planers I've used. It's got essentially one knife per revolution because of your indexable cutter head. So it's not going to be getting the advantage of 2 or 3 knives going around every revolution. I can tell a little bit of surface roughness difference between a planer that does 179 cuts per inch. So there is a little bit of difference when it comes out of the planer, but if you sand both of those, just one quick pass with a random orbital sander, you have the same finish. Another important thing for a planer is for the cutter head to be perfectly parallel with the bed, otherwise you're going to get uneven thickness on your stock. I did an 8.5 inch board, ran through this, and I measured the thickness on both sides. Both of them were down to the 1,000th of an inch. There was no measurable difference with the equipment I have in board height from one side to the other. So this is going to give you a perfectly flat board. It's not going to be, there's no difference in height from one side to the other, which is good. Let's talk power. This thing does great. I managed to do a 12-inch wide equivalent of red oak through it at 3/64 depth for the cut. So that's more than 1/32, which I was really just only hoping for because that's pretty standard for planers at full width. A 32nd of an inch is usually the max they can do. So this thing did 50% more than that. I think this handles full capacity hardwoods great. I haven't done anything super hard on it. Red oak's probably about the hardest wood I've done so far, but it did great with walnut, sweet gum, and elm, and then full width softwood of cedar running through it as well. Now there is one thing I do need to mention about power with this planer. When I first got it, I was having problems with boards that were wider about 8 inches. If I started a pass much more than a 1/64th of an inch, it would stall on me or near stall. So it sounded so bad and it was shuddering that I would just shut it off or raise the carriage to get it, not under such a loaded condition. And I went back and forth with Wahuda about what the problem was a few times, and they hadn't seen anything like it. They'd run the same test with, full width hardwood oak through this, and they said they were doing up to a 1/16th of an inch at a time when they were passing through it. So that was 4 times what I was getting. So I figured something was wrong, so I decided to let it run through and just let it completely stall. And I did that, and it got so close to stalling, and then it just started acting fine. Ran the boards through, ran them through again. I have not been able to get it to repeat that stalling that was so prevalent at the beginning when I had this ever since then. So maybe something wasn't quite seated right during assembly, and putting it in that loaded condition popped something into place. It's the only thing I can figure happened because I haven't had any issues with it since. It's done more than I expected it to power-wise after that. So just wanted to be 100% transparent. I don't think it'll be an issue with anything, but it is something I saw a one-off problem. All right, price point on this is going to be $700 for the 2-speed model, and I think that's a pretty good deal because this is one of the very few benchtop planers that has a carbide insert cutter head just stock, standard. You don't have to go buy something else and change it out. It comes with that carbide, which is a huge advantage over straight high-speed steel knives. They're a lot more durable. They're going to stay sharper longer. If you get a nick in one of them, you just got one to rotate instead of changing out a whole knife set. They can be rotated twice as much as a double-sided knife, and they're going to be quieter as well. They're a lot quieter because instead of having one big knife crashing down on your workpiece at a time, you've just got a few individual cutters hitting it. And the difference is very obvious. Wahuda is also going to be releasing a single-speed model of this one that is slightly cheaper. It's almost the same planer, it just does not have the support arms on the front and the back. It still has the tables. It's single-speed, and it won't have the depth stop turret on the far side that lets you set a repeatable depth. I believe that model is going to be $150 cheaper than this one, coming in at $550. So overall, I think this is a great planer. It's got really good power, it's got great accuracy, and the carbide cutter head really sets it apart. I think I've covered just about everything I could think of. If you have any more questions, let me know in the comment section. I'll try to answer them. Thanks for watching, and once again, don't forget to subscribe.